right, let's roll up our sleeves and get ready for a deep dive. You guys sent in a mountain of neuroscience readings, huh? Like everything from how neurons work to how we process language. We even got some stuff on consciousness.
Mm,
It's a lot to unpack.
it is. It's a fascinating field.
That's what we're here for, though, right? To sift through all the technical jargon and pull out the good stuff, the stuff that'll make you go, whoa, I never knew that about my own brain.
Exactly. It's all about those aha moments.
So let's start with the basics. Your readings keep mentioning this term, biological psychology. What's the deal with that?
Well, biological psychology is all about understanding how our biology, our genes, our hormones, our whole biological system shapes our behavior and experiences.
So like nature versus nurture. How much is our wiring and how much is the environment we're in?
It's both, actually. Biological psychology takes this really cool evolutionary perspective, too.
Oh yeah, like how our brains evolved over time.
Exactly. Think about it. Early humans, the ones who were better at spotting danger, let's say, because of a certain brain structure, they were more likely to survive, right?
Survival of the fittest.
And pass on those genes. So over generations, that brain structure would become more and more common.
So the way we think and feel today is actually influenced by what helped our ancestors survive way back then. That's wild.
It is pretty mind-blowing.
Totally. Now, let's zoom in even further. Your readings talk about these tiny things called neurons.
Neurons, the building blocks of the brain. We're talking billions of these tiny little messengers constantly zipping information throughout your nervous system.
Each one with a very specific job to do, I imagine.
You got it. And each neuron has a pretty unique structure, too, kind of like a tree.
A tree. How so?
Well, it has a cell body. Think of it as the trunk.
Yeah.
And then dendrites, which are like branches that receive information from other neurons. Then there's the axon, a long, thin fiber that sends information out.
Okay, I'm picturing it. Trunk, branches, sending messages. What are the leaves?
No leaves. But there are these things called presynaptic terminals at the end of the axon. That's where the message gets passed on to other neurons.
So we've got these billions of neurons, each sending messages. But how do they actually communicate with each other?
That's where synapses come in.
Synapses.
Yeah, there are these tiny, tiny gaps between neurons. It's not a direct connection. Instead, chemicals called neurotransmitters are released into the synapse.
Oh, so it's chemical messaging, not like an electrical current.
It's both, actually. The electrical signal travels down the neuron, but then it triggers the release of these chemicals, these neurotransmitters, that carry the message across the synapse to the next neuron.
Wow. So complex. It's like a chain reaction.
It is. And get this, the synapses aren't just static. They can actually change over time, strengthen or weaken.
Really? What makes them change?
Learning. That's the basis of learning and memory. Every new experience, every skill you learn, you're rewiring your brain at the synaptic level.
So practice makes perfect is actually a real thing in the brain.
Absolutely. The more you activate certain synapses, those connections become stronger. Think about it. Learning a new language, playing a musical instrument, anything you practice, you're literally changing the physical structure of your brain.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And motivating. So let's zoom out a bit now. Your readings talk about the cerebral cortex. It's like the brain's control center, right?
Exactly. Think CEO of the brain. The cerebral cortex is that outermost layer, and it handles all those higher level functions. Thinking, planning, perceiving, even language.
And it's divided into different lobes, right?
Yeah.
Each with its own specialty.
You got it. The occipital lobe processes visual information. The parietal lobe, that's all about touch and spatial awareness. Then there's the temporal lobe, hearing and memory. And finally, the frontal lobe, the boss, handling all that planning, decision-making, personality stuff.
Wow, so much going on in there. And, your readings mentioned these prefrontal lobotomies. Back in the mid-20th century, they actually thought they could treat mental illness by severing connections in the prefrontal cortex.
Yikes. Yeah, that was a dark chapter in medical history.
What happened to those patients?
Well, it had some devastating consequences. They often lost their ability to plan, make decisions, control their impulses. It basically robbed them of their personalities.
That's so sad. But it does highlight how crucial the prefrontal cortex is.
It does. It's really what makes us human, Our ability to think, to plan, to control ourselves.
Totally. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about one of the things that makes us uniquely human, language.
Yeah. Language. Such a powerful tool.
Is how we communicate ideas, tell stories, build entire cultures. But how does it actually work in the brain?
Your readings point to two key areas in the left hemisphere: Broca's area and Wernicke's area.
Two areas working together to give us the gift of gab. How do they each contribute?
Well, Broca's area is involved in speech production, actually forming the words and sentences we speak. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, is all about language comprehension, understanding what those words and sentences mean.
What happens if one of these areas gets damaged?
You get some really interesting and often heartbreaking cases. People with damage to Broca's area can understand language perfectly, but they struggle to speak fluently. It's like having the words on the tip of your tongue, but not being able to get them out.
I can only imagine how frustrating that would be. What about damage to Wernicke's area?
In that case, people can speak fluently, but their words are often jumbled and nonsensical. They might not even realize their speech is incoherent.
Wow, so two different areas, but both essential for language. It's like a delicate dance between production and comprehension.
Exactly. And if one part falters, the whole system is thrown off.
It really shows how specialized different parts of the brain are. Now, for the big one, consciousness. What is it? How does it work?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Your readings dive into the mind-brain relationship, exploring different theories of consciousness. And I have to say, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
It is mind-blowing for sure.
So do we have a definitive answer? Like, what is consciousness?
Not yet. It's still a big mystery. But one prevailing theory is that consciousness emerges from these complex interactions among different brain regions.
So it's not just one consciousness center.
Nope. It's more like a symphony of activity across the whole brain.
Okay, so it's a symphony. But what instruments are playing? And how does it all come together to create that sense of awareness, of me-ness?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. And there's this fascinating phenomenon called binocular rivalry.
Binocular what now?
Binocular rivalry. Imagine each of your eyes is presented with a different image.
Okay.
Even though both images are always present, your conscious perception flips back and forth between them.
Wait, really? Like my brain can only see one image at a time, even though both eyes are receiving information?
Exactly, and that raises all sorts of questions about what's happening to the information that's not consciously perceived.
So there's like a whole hidden world of information our brains are processing that we're not even aware of.
It seems that way. And get this, studies show that even those unconscious stimuli can still influence our behavior.
Whoa. That's kind of creepy, but also fascinating. Like, there's this whole other level of processing happening beneath the surface, shaping our thoughts, feelings, actions, and we don't even know about it.
It's pretty wild, isn't it?
Totally. Okay, shifting gears a little bit. Your readings also mentioned brain development. How did the brain change over time?
Well, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Okay, hold up. What does that even mean?
It's just a fancy way of saying that the development of an individual that's ontogeny kind of mirrors the evolutionary history of the species phylogeny.
Oh, okay. So by studying how our brains develop, we can get clues about how the brain evolved over millions of years.
Exactly. And your readings delve into that whole process of brain development, from the earliest stages in the womb to the complex wiring that happens during childhood. It's not just about genes either. The environment plays a huge role.
So nature versus nurture again.
Yep. Genes provide the blueprint, but experiences shape how that blueprint is expressed. Think about it. A child growing up in a stimulating environment with lots of opportunities to learn and explore, they're going to develop different neural connections than a child who's deprived of those experiences.
It really underscores the importance of early childhood experiences, huh?
Absolutely. Creating environments that nurture healthy brain development is crucial.
Okay, let's talk about something we all think about a lot and something that's pretty essential for survival. Food. Why do we get hungry? What are the biological mechanisms that drive our appetite?
Your readings point to a complex system of hormones, neurotransmitters, and brain regions, all working together to regulate our eating behavior.
So like a whole team effort to keep our energy levels balanced.
That's it, maintaining homeostasis. And the hypothalamus, remember that tiny region of the brain we talked about earlier? Well, it plays a starring role in this system.
So the hypothalamus is telling us when to eat and when to stop.
Yep. Think of it as the brain's thermostat, but for hunger, thirst, and even sleep.
Interesting. But it's not acting alone, right?
Right.
There must be signals from the body, too, that influence our appetite.
Absolutely. Your readings discuss hormones like leptin, ghrelin, and insulin. Leptin, produced by fat cells, signals satiety, that feeling of fullness after a meal. Ghrelin, produced by the stomach, does the opposite. It signals hunger, those tummy rumbles that tell you it's time to eat. And then insulin helps cells absorb glucose from the bloodstream.
Okay, so we've got hormone signaling, fullness and hunger, and insulin managing our blood sugar levels. But how do they all work together to regulate our eating?
Think of it as a feedback loop. The brain, the body, and even the environment are constantly interacting to maintain this energy balance. If our blood sugar drops, insulin levels decrease, ghrelin increases, and we feel hungry. After a meal, blood sugar rises, insulin increases, leptin is released, and we feel full.
So it's this intricate dance of hormones and brain signals.
Yeah.
It makes you appreciate how much is happening behind the scenes just to keep us fueled and functioning.
Mm.
But of course, sometimes the system can go awry, leading to eating disorders like obesity, anorexia, or bulimia, right?
Unfortunately, yes. These disorders really highlight the fact that our homeostatic mechanisms aren't foolproof. And it's not just about biology either. Psychological and social factors play a huge role as well.
It's that nature versus nurture debate again, but applied to something as basic as eating.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we need to approach these issues with sensitivity and understanding, acknowledging that there are multiple factors at play.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about another powerful drive that's essential for survival. And let's be honest, something we all think about a lot. Sex. What drives our sexual behavior? And how do those drives differ between men and women?
Well, as you might imagine, hormones play a major role in shaping our sexual desires and behaviors.
So we're talking testosterone in men and estrogen in women.
It's not quite that simple. Both men and women have both testosterone and estrogen, just in different amounts. It's really the balance between these hormones rather than the presence or absence of one that matters.
So it's not just about having a male hormone or a female hormone. It's about this unique hormonal cocktail each individual has.
Exactly. And this balance can be influenced by all sorts of things like genetics, prenatal environment, even social experiences.
Wow, so our hormonal profiles, and therefore our sexual behaviors, are shaped by a combination of nature and nurture, just like with brain development.
Exactly. And your readings go into some fascinating research on how these hormones influence sexual behavior, not just in humans, but in animals as well.
I bet that research gets pretty interesting. What are some of the key takeaways?
For example, studies have shown that testosterone levels can fluctuate in response to social situations, like winning or losing a competition.
Wait, really? So our social experiences can actually influence our hormone levels, which can then influence our behavior.
It's a feedback loop. Hormones influence behavior, and behavior influences hormones.
That's amazing. Our social world is literally shaping our biology. But what about the brain itself? Are there specific brain regions involved in sexual behavior?
Absolutely. The hypothalamus, that tiny but mighty region we talked about earlier, plays a key role in regulating sexual behavior, along with those other basic drives like hunger and thirst.
So the hypothalamus is like the brain's grand central station for motivation. It receives input from different parts of the body and the environment, and then orchestrates our responses, including our sexual behaviors.
You could say that. And it's connected to other brain regions, like the amygdala, which processes emotions, and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory.
So our sexual experiences aren't just about the physical act itself. They're also about the emotions, the memories, and the social context surrounding them.
Exactly. Sexual behavior is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon. It involves a whole symphony of brain activity.
And speaking of complex, your readings also touch on the topic of sexual orientation, whether someone is attracted to the same sex, the opposite sex, or both. What's the current understanding of the biological basis of sexual orientation?
That's an area of ongoing research, and there's still a lot we don't know. But current research suggests that sexual orientation, like so many other aspects of our behavior, is likely influenced by a combination of genetic, hormonal, and environmental factors.
So it's not just a single gay gene or straight gene. It's much more nuanced than that.
Exactly. It's a complex trait shaped by a variety of influences.
Okay, we've talked about hunger, we've talked about sex, and now let's talk about another basic drive that's essential for survival. Sleep. We spend roughly a third of our lives asleep. But why? What's the biological purpose of sleep?
That's a question that has baffled scientists for ages. We still don't have a definitive answer.
But surely there must be some theories about why we sleep.
Oh, absolutely. One prominent theory is that sleep is essential for restoration. It allows the body and brain to repair and recharge after a long day.
So, like a nightly pit stop for maintenance and repairs, our bodies and brains get to rest and recuperate so we're ready to tackle the next day.
Exactly. And there's evidence to support this. During sleep, our bodies release growth hormone, which helps repair tissues, and our brains clear out waste products that have accumulated throughout the day.
So sleep is like a cleaning crew for the brain, too, taking out the trash while we rest.
You could say that. But it's not just about physical repair either. Your readings highlight the role of sleep in memory consolidation.
Oh, yeah. So it's actually helping us learn and remember things.
It is. During sleep, our brains process and store information we've learned throughout the day, making it more likely we'll remember it later.
So those all-nighters I used to pull in college, cramming for exams, were probably counterproductive.
Most likely. Sleep is crucial for actually retaining information. Chronic sleep deprivation can have some pretty serious cognitive consequences.
Good to know. Okay, so sleep helps our bodies and brains recover and improves memory. Anything else?
It's also incredibly important for emotional regulation. It helps us process and cope with stressful experiences.
So a good night's sleep can make us more resilient to stress.
Absolutely. And chronic sleep deprivation can actually make us more vulnerable to anxiety and depression.
Okay, I'm convinced. Sleep is officially essential. It helps our bodies and brains recover, improves memory, and even makes us emotionally stronger. But it's not just one big block of unconsciousness, right? There are different stages of sleep.
You got it. Sleep is a cycle of different stages, each characterized by unique brain activity patterns.
And how do we know about these different stages?
We can actually measure these brainwave patterns using an EEG, an electroencephalogram. It records the electrical activity of the brain, and it shows clear differences between the stages of sleep.
So what are these stages?
There are four main stages: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and REM sleep.
Okay, let's break those down. What happens in stage 1?
Stage 1 is that light sleep, where we're just drifting off. The EEG shows slower brainwaves compared to when we're awake.
And then stage 2?
Stage 2 is where sleep deepens and brain activity slows down even more. You see these things called sleep spindles and K complexes on the EEG.
Sleep spindles and K complexes, what are those?
They're just unique patterns of brain activity. They're thought to play a role in memory consolidation and blocking out external stimuli.
Interesting. And then we enter stage 3.
Yep. Stage 3, sometimes called slow wave sleep, is the deepest stage. The EEG shows these slow delta waves. It's crucial for restoration and memory consolidation. Waking someone up from stage 3 is tough, and they're often groggy and disoriented if you do.
Sounds like a heavy sleep for sure. And then there's REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep.
Yes, REM sleep. This is where things get really interesting. Our brains are super active, almost like we're awake, but our muscles are paralyzed.
So like our brains are having a party, but our bodies are stuck in bed.
Exactly. And it's during REM sleep that we experience those vivid, often bizarre dreams.
So we cycle through these different stages throughout the night. Is there a specific order to it?
Typically, yeah, we start with stage 1, then go through stages 2 and 3, then back up to stage 2, and then into REM sleep. This cycle repeats itself multiple times throughout the night, and the duration of each stage changes as the night goes on.
So we're constantly shifting between these different sleep stages. But what happens when our sleep goes awry?
Sleep disorders are actually really common, and they can have a huge impact on our health and well-being.
Like insomnia, sleep apnea, narcolepsy?
Exactly. Insomnia, the most common one, that's when people have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. Sleep apnea is where people repeatedly stop breathing during sleep, which disrupts their rest. And narcolepsy, that's a neurological disorder that causes excessive daytime sleepiness and sometimes these sudden, uncontrollable sleep attacks.
All of those sound pretty serious. What about those weird behaviors some people exhibit during sleep, like sleepwalking or night terrors?
Those are called parasomnias. They can be pretty creepy, I know, but they're often harmless, especially in kids.
Okay, so we've covered sleep stages, functions, disorders. It's clearly as vital as eating for our well-being. But what about our emotions? What's the biological basis of our feelings? And why do we even have emotions in the first place?
Emotions are fascinating. They're complex experiences, and they involve a whole symphony of brain activity, plus physiological changes throughout the body.
So it's not just feelings in our heads, it's also physical reactions, like changes in our heart rate, breathing, even sweating.
You got it. And those physical reactions are part of what makes emotions so powerful. They actually prepare us for action.
Like the fight or flight response.
Yeah.
When we feel fear, our hearts race and our muscles tense up, getting us ready to either fight or flee.
Exactly. That's a classic example. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in, preparing us to deal with a perceived threat.
So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for those emergency responses. But what about other emotions, like happiness, sadness, anger? Do they all have specific biological pathways, too?
It's an area of ongoing research, and there isn't one single emotion center in the brain. But your readings do point to the amygdala, that alarm system we talked about earlier, as playing a key role, especially for fear.
So the amygdala is constantly scanning our environment for threats and then triggers the fight or flight response if it detects something dangerous.
That's the basic idea. And the amygdala is also involved in learning and memory, which is why we can develop phobias, those irrational fears.
So, like, if you have a traumatic experience with a dog, the amygdala might learn to associate dogs with danger, triggering a fear response even when there's no real threat.
Exactly. It's like our brains are wired to protect us from perceived danger, even if that danger isn't always real.
It's like having a super sensitive smoke detector that goes off even when there's just a little bit of steam.
Haha, good analogy. But the amygdala isn't the only brain region involved. Your readings discuss the insula's role in processing disgust and the prefrontal cortex in regulating emotions.
So the insula is like our internal UW meter, and the prefrontal cortex is like the emotion control center,
Yep.
helping us manage our feelings.
You could think of it that way. All these different brain regions work together to create our emotional experiences.
But what happens when things go wrong? Your readings mention emotional disorders like anxiety and depression.
Right. Those disorders highlight the fact that our emotional systems aren't always perfectly balanced. And just like with eating disorders, it's not just about biology. Psychological and social factors play a huge role as well.
So they're complex, with multiple contributing factors. But what about the biological underpinnings? What's happening in the brain when someone's struggling with anxiety, for instance?
Your sources point to an overactive amygdala as a key factor. It's like that alarm system is stuck on overdrive, constantly perceiving threats, even when there aren't any.
So the amygdala is sending out false alarms, triggering the fight or flight response in safe situations. That must be exhausting.
It is. And this constant state of hypervigilance can lead to all those physical symptoms of anxiety, the racing heart, sweating, difficulty breathing. It can also lead to avoidance behaviors where people try to minimize their exposure to those anxiety-provoking situations.
It makes sense that people would try to avoid those triggers. But what about depression? What's going on in the brain when someone's depressed?
Depression is even more complex, and there's no single brain region that's responsible for it. But your readings mention imbalances in neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine.
Ah, those chemical messengers we talked about earlier.
Exactly. These neurotransmitters play crucial roles in mood regulation, motivation, even sleep. And when they're out of balance, it can disrupt those functions, leading to all those classic symptoms of depression, sadness, fatigue, loss of interest in things that were once enjoyable.
So it's like the brain's chemical symphony is off-key, leading to a whole range of emotional and behavioral changes.
That's a good way to put it. And these imbalances can be caused by a variety of things, including genetics, stress, even chronic inflammation.
So again, it's this complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to these disorders.
Exactly. And understanding those factors is key to developing effective treatments.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about a more severe mental illness. Schizophrenia. What's happening in the brain when someone has schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is a tough one. It's a complex and challenging mental illness that really affects a person's ability to think, feel, and behave clearly. We're talking about symptoms like hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and social withdrawal.
It sounds incredibly debilitating. What causes it?
The exact cause is still unknown, but research points to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. It tends to run in families, suggesting there's a genetic component, but things like prenatal infections or exposure to stress during early development can also increase the risk.
So it's likely multiple factors that converge to trigger this complex disorder. But what about the brain itself? Are there physical differences we can see in the brains of people with schizophrenia?
Yes, there are. Your readings mention several brain abnormalities often seen in people with schizophrenia, like differences in both structure and function. For example, enlarged ventricles, which are those fluid-filled spaces in the brain.
And does that mean there's a loss of brain tissue?
Exactly. And there are also differences in the activity of certain brain regions, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. It's like the brain's wiring is different.
So it's structured differently and functioning differently. What about neurotransmitters? Are they involved in schizophrenia as well?
Absolutely. Your readings highlight the role of dopamine, particularly.
Dopamine, that's the neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward, right?
That's right. And in schizophrenia, there seems to be an overactivity of dopamine in certain brain pathways.
So too much of a good thing in a sense.
You could say that. This overactivity might help explain some of those symptoms, like hallucinations and delusions.
It's just amazing how these tiny chemical messengers can have such profound effects on our thoughts, feelings, and behavior.
It's a delicate balance.
Okay, so we've explored all sorts of topics related to biological psychology, neurons, brain regions, hormones, neurotransmitters, even mental illnesses. It's clear that the brain is incredibly complex, and there's so much we still don't understand.
That's the beauty of it, though, isn't it? There's always more to discover.
It is. But it's also clear that the brain is this incredibly powerful and intricate organ that plays a central role in everything we do.
Absolutely. It's the command center for our entire being.
And it's not just about the brain itself, right? It's about how the brain interacts with the body, with the environment, with other people. It's about how all these biological processes ultimately give rise to behavior, how we act, how we think, how we feel, how we experience the world.
That's it. Behavior is the output of the brain, the way we manifest our inner world in the external world.
And there's so many different types of behavior to explore. We've already talked about things like eating, sleeping, and mating.
But there are so many others. Learning, memory, language, decision-making, problem-solving, creativity. The list goes on and on.
And all of these behaviors are rooted in those biological processes we've been talking about, from the firing of neurons to the release of hormones.
Exactly. It's like this incredible chain reaction. Genes influence brain development influences brain activity influences behavior.
And then that behavior feeds back to influence the environment, which can further influence gene expression and brain development. It's like this never-ending loop.
It is a complex, dynamic system with all these different levels of interaction.
It really makes you realize how interconnected everything is, our biology, our behavior, and the environment we live in.
Absolutely. It's all part of the grand tapestry of life.
Okay, so we've established that the brain is incredibly complex and plays this central role in everything we do. But how do we actually study this mysterious organ? How do we unravel its secrets?
That's where research methods come in. Your readings talk about all sorts of techniques scientists use to study the brain. Each one gives us a different piece of the puzzle.
Like brain imaging techniques, for example. I've heard of things like fMRI and PET scans.
Exactly. Those techniques allow us to see the brain in action, to observe which areas are active during different tasks or experiences.
So we can actually see which parts of the brain light up when someone's solving a math problem or listening to music.
Precisely. It's amazing, isn't it? These techniques have really revolutionized our understanding of the brain. But brain imaging isn't the only tool we have. There are also lesion studies where researchers look at the effects of damage to specific brain areas.
Oh, yeah, we talked about those earlier with the hypothalamus lesions.
Right, and those studies can tell us a lot about the function of different brain regions. By observing what happens when a certain area is damaged, we can infer what it normally does.
So if damage to a particular area causes someone to lose their ability to speak, we can guess that that area is probably involved in language production. It's like reverse engineering the brain.
Exactly. And then we also have electrophysiological recordings, where researchers measure the electrical activity of individual neurons.
So it's like eavesdropping on the brain's conversations, listening in on how individual neurons are communicating with each other.
That's a good analogy. These recordings give us incredibly detailed information about how neurons work, how they process information, and how they contribute to the overall function of the brain.
It's amazing how far we've come in our ability to study the brain. And with all these new technologies emerging, who knows what we'll discover next.
It's an exciting time to be a brain researcher, that's for sure.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more concept that you mentioned earlier, plasticity. What does it mean for the brain to be plastic?
Brain plasticity refers to the brain's amazing ability to change and adapt throughout life. It's not this fixed, static organ. It's a dynamic system that's constantly evolving.
So even though our brains are shaped by our genes and early experiences, they're not set in stone. We can continue to learn and grow, and our brains can adapt to those new challenges.
Exactly. And this plasticity is essential for learning, memory, and even recovery from injury.
That's a really empowering message.
Mm.
It means we're not limited by our past or by our biology.
Absolutely. We have the potential to continue shaping our brains throughout our lives, through our experiences, our choices, and our actions.
And we're back. More brain-bending fun coming your way in this deep dive.
It's amazing what we're learning about this 3-pound universe we carry around in our skulls, isn't it?
Seriously, before the break, we were geeking out on the brain's plasticity. It's constantly changing and adapting, right?
Absolutely. It's like our experiences are sculpting our neural pathways, constantly strengthening or weakening connections, forging new paths, and letting go of old ones.
So it's not just about the brain we're born with. We actually have a say in how it evolves.
Precisely. And that has huge implications for how we learn, how we parent, how we approach personal growth. The potential is immense.
Totally empowering. But this amazing adaptable brain, it's not just floating around on its own, right? It's part of a larger network, the nervous system.
Right. Think of it as the body's super sophisticated communication network, constantly relaying messages between the brain and every other part of you.
And it's divided into two main parts, right? Central and peripheral nervous systems.
Yep. The central nervous system is like command central. That's the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is the vast network of messengers branching out from there, carrying signals throughout the body.
So central makes the decisions, peripheral carries them out, relaying information back and forth.
Perfect analogy. And to make things even more interesting, the peripheral nervous system is further divided into two branches, somatic and autonomic.
Okay, I'm intrigued with the difference.
The somatic nervous system is all about those voluntary movements, walking, talking, reaching for that coffee cup. It allows us to interact with the world consciously.
So it's the one that gives us conscious control over our actions.
Okay.
What about the autonomic?
The autonomic nervous system is the one working behind the scenes. It controls all those involuntary functions that just happen automatically. Breathing, heart rate, digestion, keeping the body running smoothly without us having to micromanage everything.
One for conscious action, one for automatic processes. Makes sense. But wait, you said the autonomic nervous system was further divided.
I did. It has two branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic, each with opposing effects.
Okay, now it's getting juicy. Tell me more.
Imagine walking down a dark street and hearing footsteps behind you. Your heart starts pounding, palms sweat, you get that adrenaline rush. That's your sympathetic nervous system kicking in, prepping you for fight or flight.
Our body's emergency response system.
Exactly. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, getting you ready to react quickly to a perceived threat. And once the threat is gone, the parasympathetic nervous system comes in to calm things down, slows your heart rate, lowers blood pressure, and gets digestion going again. It's the rest and digest system.
So it's like a yin and yang of the nervous system. One revs us up, the other chills us out. Together they maintain that balance, that homeostasis we talked about.
Precisely. Working in tandem to keep our internal environment stable, even when the outside world throws us curveballs.
Pretty amazing. Okay, we've got this intricate communication network, this interplay of systems keeping us functioning. But how do we actually perceive the world around us? How does our brain translate all that sensory information into meaningful experiences?
That's where our sensory systems come in, those amazing gateways to the world. Your readings were full of details about how our brains process sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touch.
And each sense has its own specialized receptors, right? Cells designed to detect specific types of stimuli.
Exactly. Vision. We have photoreceptors in our eyes that detect light. Hearing. It's hair cells in our ears that pick up those sound waves. For smell and taste, it's chemoreceptors in our noses and tongues detecting chemicals. And touch. That's mechanoreceptors in our skin that respond to pressure and vibration.
It's like we have this team of specialized reporters, each covering a different beat, sending information back to the brain for processing.
Love that analogy. And once those receptors detect a stimulus, they send signals along neural pathways to the brain. That's where the magic happens.
So it's not just about sensing the world, it's about making sense of it.
Exactly. The brain doesn't just passively receive information. It actively constructs our perceptions, weaving together the sensory data with our past experiences, expectations, even our emotions.
A truly collaborative effort. Let's talk about vision for a minute. Arguably our most dominant sense, right?
Absolutely. Your readings go into the fascinating details of how vision works. Starts with light entering the eye through the pupil, passing through the lens.
And then it hits the retina at the back of the eye, where those photoreceptors you mentioned come into play.
Right. Think of the retina as the eye's movie screen, where the light show is projected. And it contains those two types of photoreceptors, rods and cones.
Right. Rods and cones. What's the difference again?
Rods are super sensitive, allowing us to see in dim light, but they don't detect color. Cones, on the other hand, are all about color vision, but they need brighter light to work.
So we have different cells for seeing in the dark and seeing in colors. That's so cool.
It is, and those cells are distributed differently across the retina. Rods are concentrated in the periphery, while cones are packed in the fovea.
The fovea.
That's the central part of the retina responsible for our sharpest vision.
Ah, that makes sense. Our peripheral vision is good at detecting movement, but not so much detail. We can see something moving out of the corner of our eye, but it's blurry unless we look directly at it.
Precisely. Efficient design, allocating resources where they're needed most. But back to the process. What happens after light hits those photoreceptors?
Well, that information has to get to the brain somehow.
It does. The photoreceptors send signals to bipolar cells, which in turn send signals to ganglion cells.
And those ganglion cells, their axons, form the optic nerve, right? Like
Yeah.
a superhighway carrying visual information to the brain.
You got it. And here's a fun fact. The optic nerve actually exits the eye at a point called the blind spot because there are no photoreceptors there.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
We have a blind spot in each eye.
We do, but our brain is so clever it fills in that missing information based on the surrounding visual data. We don't even notice it.
That's wild. Our brains are constantly working behind the scenes, filling in gaps and making our visual experience seamless. So the optic nerve carries the information to the brain. Where does it go from there?
First stop, the thalamus, our trusty relay station, remember, directs sensory information to the right areas of the brain.
Grand central station for the senses.
Exactly. From the thalamus, visual information gets sent to the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, home to the primary visual cortex.
And that's where the real visual processing happens.
You got it. The occipital lobe analyzes shapes, colors, motion, depth, helping us make sense of what we're seeing. But it's not a solo act. It's connected to a whole network of other brain areas, each specializing in processing different aspects of vision.
So some areas are for recognizing faces, others for perceiving motion.
Precisely. This intricate network allows us to create this unified, coherent visual experience. But remember, it's not just about passively receiving visual information. Our brains are actively shaping our perceptions based on our expectations, experiences, emotions, all that top-down processing we talked about.
Right. It's like our brains are constantly making predictions about what we're going to see,
Yeah.
and those predictions actually shape our perceptions.
Exactly. It's essential for making sense of a world that's often complex and ambiguous.
Mind-blowing. Okay, we've tackled how we see the world. What about hearing? How do our brains process all those sounds?
Hearing is pretty remarkable, too. Your readings get into the details of how we perceive sound. It all starts with sound waves entering the ear, vibrating the eardrum.
And those vibrations get passed along to the middle ear, right? Where those tiny bones, the malleus and tankus and stapes, do their thing.
Exactly. Those three bones amplify the vibrations and pass them on to the inner ear, where the cochlea is located.
The cochlea, that spiral-shaped structure filled with fluid.
That's the one. Inside the cochlea, you've got those hair cells, the specialized receptors for detecting sound waves. They're lined up along the basilar membrane, which runs the length of the cochlea.
And different parts of that membrane are sensitive to different frequencies of sound.
Yeah. Got it. High frequencies vibrate the base of the cochlea. Low frequencies vibrate the apex. It's like a mini harp inside our ears, each string tuned to a different note.
So when a sound wave comes in, it creates a specific pattern of vibrations along the basilar membrane, activating different hair cells depending on the frequency of the sound.
Precisely. And those hair cells send signals to the auditory nerve, which then carries the information to the brain.
And just like with vision, it goes to the thalamus first, and then to the primary auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe, right?
Right, again. And from there, the signals are sent to a network of other brain areas, each specializing in processing different aspects of sound, recognizing speech, perceiving music, even figuring out where a sound is coming from.
So just like vision, there's this whole network of brain regions working together to create our auditory experience. And that top-down processing is at play here too, right? Our expectations and knowledge influence what we hear.
Absolutely. It's what allows us to understand speech in a noisy environment, pick out a familiar melody, or even anticipate a sound before it happens.
Our brains are constantly weaving together sensory information and our internal models of the world.
It's pretty impressive when you think about it.
It is. Okay, let's move on to touch. How do we experience the physical world through touch?
Your readings highlighted that intricate network of receptors and pathways that make it possible.
So we have different types of receptors in our skin that are sensitive to different kinds of touch.
Yep. Mechanoreceptors detect pressure, vibration, stretch. Thermoreceptors detect temperature, hot and cold. and nociceptors detect pain.
It's like having a whole security system built into our skin, constantly monitoring for changes in pressure, temperature, and potential ouchies.
Exactly. And those receptors are distributed differently across the body. Fingertips, lips, highly sensitive, packed with receptors. Other areas, like our backs, not so much.
Makes sense. We use our hands and mouths to explore the world in a very tactile way. But how does that information from the receptors actually get to the brain?
Signals travel along sensory nerves to the spinal cord, then up to the brain. Just like with vision and hearing, first stop is the thalamus, then on to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe.
And the somatosensory cortex is organized like a map of the body, right?
You're thinking of the somatotopic map, which shows how the brain represents the body. The area that receives input from our hands is right next to the area that receives input from our arms, and so on.
So if you stimulate a specific spot on the somatosensory cortex, it would feel like you're being touched on the corresponding part of your body.
That's the general idea, although it's more complex than that in reality. But it illustrates that the brain has this very specific representation of the body and its sensory inputs.
So touch isn't just about passively receiving information. It's about the brain actively interpreting it, creating an experience of our physical selves and the world around us.
Exactly. And just like with the other senses, top-down processing is at work here too. Expectations, knowledge, and context all shape our tactile perceptions.
It's amazing how our brains are constantly integrating information from all our senses to create this seamless experience. Now let's move on to taste, that sense that lets us enjoy all the delicious flavors the world has to offer.
Taste is indeed fascinating, and your readings did a deep dive into how our brains distinguish those basic tastes and create that perception of flavor.
So it all starts with those taste buds on our tongues, those little bumps packed with taste receptor cells.
Exactly. And those receptor cells can detect 5 basic tastes: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami.
Umami. That's the savory, meaty taste, right? I didn't realize it was a basic taste category.
It's a relatively recent addition to the list, but definitely distinct and important.
So we have different receptors for each of those 5 tastes, and they're distributed differently across the tongue.
Actually, that's a common misconception. While there might be some regional differences in sensitivity, all areas of the tongue can detect all 5 basic tastes.
Oh, interesting. I always thought certain parts of the tongue were for specific tastes, but it seems the tongue is more democratic than that. So how does the information from those taste receptors get to the brain?
Just like with the other senses, those signals travel along sensory nerves to the brainstem and then up to the thalamus.
And from the thalamus, the information goes to the gustatory cortex, which is in the insula, right?
That's right. The gustatory cortex is responsible for processing and interpreting taste information, creating our conscious experience of flavor.
But it doesn't work in isolation, right? Taste is often linked to our other senses, like smell, and also to our emotions and memories.
Absolutely. Taste information is sent to a network of brain areas, including the amygdala, which processes emotions, and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. That's why certain tastes can evoke such strong emotional memories.
Like the taste of your grandmother's cookies, bringing back floods of childhood memories.
Exactly. Taste, emotion, and memory are tightly intertwined. And of course, top-down processing plays a role here too. Our expectations, cultural background, even our mood can influence what we taste and how we experience those flavors.
It's fascinating how our perceptions are constantly being shaped by this interplay of bottom-up sensory information and top-down cognitive processes. Okay, we've covered vision, hearing, touch, and taste. That leaves one final sense to explore: smell.
Smell, often called our most primitive sense, is closely linked to our survival instincts and has this incredible power to trigger emotions and memories.
And unlike the other senses, olfactory information doesn't go through the thalamus before reaching the cortex, right?
That's right. The olfactory nerve carries signals from the olfactory receptors in our noses straight to the olfactory bulb, which is located right at the front of the brain.
So smell has a more direct route to the brain.
Exactly. And from the olfactory bulb, information gets sent to a variety of brain areas, including the piriform cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus.
Ah, the amygdala and hippocampus again. Those areas process emotions and memories, which explains why certain smells can trigger such strong feelings and bring back vivid memories.
Precisely. Those connections are what make smell so powerful and evocative.
It's like scents unlock these hidden compartments in our brains, flooding us with feelings and memories from the past. No wonder aromatherapy and essential oils are so popular. But does top-down processing play a role in smell?
Absolutely. Our expectations, past experiences, even our cultural background all influence what we smell and how we interpret those odors.
So if we're expecting a pleasant smell, we might perceive it as such even if the actual scent is a bit ambiguous.
Exactly. Our brains are always striving to make sense of the world, and that includes the world of smells.
We've journeyed through all five senses: vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. It's incredible how our brains take in all that sensory information, process it, and ultimately create this rich and meaningful experience of the world.
It's a remarkable symphony of neural activity, a testament to the brain's incredible power and complexity.
Totally. But it's not just about passively perceiving the world.
Yeah.
We also interact with it, move through it. So how does our brain control all those actions?
Another fascinating area of biological psychology. Your readings explore the neural pathways behind our movements, from simple reflexes to those complex coordinated actions we perform every day.
It all starts with muscles, right? Those bundles of fibers that contract and relax, allowing us to move. But what controls the muscles?
Muscles are controlled by motor neurons, specialized nerve cells that extend from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles.
So it's like the brain sends messages down these motor neurons telling the muscles what to do.
Exactly. Those messages originate in the motor cortex, located in the frontal lobe.
The motor cortex, isn't that the area organized like a map of the body?
Yep. The motor homunculus, another fascinating example of how the brain represents the body.
So different parts of the motor cortex control different parts of the body.
Precisely. The area controlling our hands is next to the area controlling our arms, and so on. When a specific area of the motor cortex is activated, it sends signals down those corresponding motor neurons, causing the associated muscles to contract.
So if you stimulate a point on the motor cortex, the corresponding muscle would twitch.
That's the simplified version. Movement is much more complex, involving a symphony of neural activity across multiple brain regions. But the motor cortex is a crucial starting point.
So the motor cortex sends commands to the muscles. But it's not a one-way street, is it? The brain is also getting feedback from the muscles.
Absolutely. We have sensory receptors in our muscles and joints that provide constant feedback to the brain. This feedback is key for things like balance, posture, and fine motor control.
So it's like a closed-loop system, constant communication between the brain and the muscles, allowing for those precise and coordinated movements.
Exactly. Imagine trying to walk or write without that feedback loop. It would be chaotic.
We really take those smooth, coordinated movements for granted. Okay, so what about those other brain regions involved in movement? We've got the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the brain stem, right?
They're all essential players. The basal ganglia are involved in planning and initiating movements, helping us choose the right movements and suppress those unwanted ones.
So like the movement strategist, making sure we don't do anything clumsy.
Exactly. Then there's the cerebellum, which coordinates and smooths out our movements, helps us maintain balance, make adjustments on the fly, and learn new motor skills.
The cerebellum is like the movement choreographer, ensuring our movements are graceful and efficient.
Perfect analogy. And finally, we have the brain stem, the most primitive part of the brain, controlling those essential basic movements like breathing and swallowing.
So it's the movement autopilot, keeping those vital functions running smoothly.
Exactly. Often overlooked, but so crucial.
Okay, so we've got this intricate network, each region playing its part. But it's not all automatic, right?
Right.
We also have voluntary control. We decide to reach for a glass of water, walk to the store, dance to our favorite song.
Absolutely. And that conscious control originates in the prefrontal cortex, our executive control center.
So the prefrontal cortex sets the goals, and then the other brain regions, like the motor cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, work together to make those goals happen.
A beautifully orchestrated symphony of neural activity.
Our brains are incredible. It's mind-blowing to think about all this happening behind the scenes just to make our bodies move.
It is, and it highlights the importance of staying active and challenging those motor skills throughout life. It's not just for physical health, but for cognitive health as well.
So get out there and move. Your brain will thank you. Okay, before we wrap up this section, let's shift gears and talk about learning. It's what allows us to adapt to new environments, acquire new skills, and pass knowledge down through generations.
Learning is a testament to the brain's flexibility and adaptability. It's truly remarkable.
So at its core, how does learning actually happen in the brain? What's going on at that cellular level?
Well, learning involves changes in the connections between neurons, those synapses we keep talking about.
Those tiny gaps where neurotransmitters carry the messages.
Exactly. Learning makes those connections stronger or weaker, making it easier or harder for neurons to fire together. It's like carving new pathways in the brain.
And this is what we call synaptic plasticity, right?
Right on. And there are two main types, long-term potentiation, or LTP, and long-term depression, or LTD.
LTP and LTD. Okay, what's the difference?
Think of LTP as turning up the volume on communication between two neurons. It strengthens that connection, making it more likely the postsynaptic neuron will fire when the presynaptic neuron signals. LTD is the opposite, turning down the volume, weakening the connection.
So LTP builds a stronger bridge between two neurons. LTD weakens or dismantles it.
Perfect analogy. And these changes in synaptic strength are the foundation of learning and memory. When we learn something new, the relevant connections get strengthened through LTP, making it easier for those neurons to fire together and reactivate that information later.
So practice really does make perfect, at least at the neural level.
Exactly. And LTD is important too. It lets us prune away connections that are no longer useful, making the brain more efficient and adaptable.
Like decluttering our mental attic, making space for new stuff. So what's happened at the molecular level with all these changes in synaptic strength?
Things get a bit more complex there, but let's keep it simple. In LTP, a key player is the neurotransmitter glutamate.
Glutamate, that's the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, right?
You got it. It helps neurons fire more easily. When glutamate is released at a synapse, it binds to special receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, triggering an electrical signal.
And during LTP, there's an increase in the number and sensitivity of those glutamate receptors, making the synapse more responsive to glutamate and more likely to fire.
Exactly. It's like the postsynaptic neuron is becoming more attuned to the signals from the presynaptic neuron, making the connection stronger.
So the more those two neurons fire together, the stronger their bond becomes, making it easier for them to fire together in the future.
A good way to think about it. There are also changes in the structure of the synapse itself. The postsynaptic neuron might grow new dendritic spines.
Dendritic spines.
Those tiny protrusions that receive input from other neurons. It's like the neuron is physically changing its shape to accommodate the increased activity.
Our brains are physically changing as we learn, rewiring themselves. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And it highlights the importance of lifelong learning, keeping our brains stimulated.
Totally. So we understand those cellular mechanisms behind learning, the changes in synaptic strength that make it possible for neurons to fire together more easily. But how does all this translate to actual behavior? How do these microscopic changes in our synapses lead to acquiring new knowledge and skills?
That's where things get even more fascinating because it's not just individual synapses, it's entire networks of neurons working together.
So those networks are constantly adapting and reorganizing as we learn, like a city constantly building new roads and bridges to accommodate the flow of traffic.
A great analogy. And different brain regions are involved in different types of learning. Your readings mention classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and spatial learning.
Okay, let's break those down. What's classical conditioning?
Think of Pavlov's dogs. They learn to associate the sound of a bell with food. Eventually, they'd start salivating just at the sound of the bell, even with no food present.
They learn to anticipate the food based on the bell.
Exactly. That's classical conditioning, associating two stimuli with each other, and it involves the amygdala and the cerebellum.
The amygdala, the emotion center, and the cerebellum, which is involved in motor coordination.
Right. The amygdala helps associate stimuli with emotional responses, and the cerebellum helps learn new motor responses.
So in Pavlov's experiment, the dogs learned to associate the bell with the good feeling of getting food, and that connection happened in the amygdala. And the cerebellum helped them learn to salivate in anticipation.
Exactly. Beautiful interplay of brain regions.
What about operant conditioning? How's that different?
Operant conditioning is about associating a behavior with its consequences.
So like if you do something and get rewarded, you're more likely to do it again. If you do something and get punished, you're less likely to repeat it.
Precisely. Trial and error learning, figuring out what works and what doesn't. And this type of learning involves the basal ganglia and the dopamine system.
The basal ganglia, those are involved in planning and initiating movements, right? And dopamine is the pleasure and reward neurotransmitter.
That's right. The basal ganglia helps select and execute actions, and the dopamine system provides that reinforcement signal, strengthening the connections between the neurons involved in the rewarding behaviors.
So when we experience something pleasurable, dopamine is released, and that reinforces the behavior that led to that reward.
Exactly. It's the brain saying, hey, that was good. Let's do that again.
It's amazing how these mechanisms underlie our everyday learning and decision-making. What about spatial learning?
Spatial learning is about learning the layout of our environment, remembering where things are, how to get from one place to another, basically building a mental map.
Like remembering how to get to the grocery store or navigating through a new city.
Exactly. And this type of learning involves the hippocampus.
The hippocampus, that's crucial for forming new memories, right?
You got it. The hippocampus is key for encoding and consolidating spatial memories, creating a mental map we can use later.
So every time we explore a new place, our hippocampus is building a neural representation of that space.
It's like our own internal GPS system, constantly being updated.
Incredible. Okay, so we've got classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and spatial learning. 3 different types of learning, each involving different brain regions and neurotransmitters.
The brain is truly a master learner, adapting and evolving through a variety of mechanisms.
But learning is only half the story.
Mhm.
We also need to remember to be able to access that information later. That's where memory comes in.
Absolutely. Memory is essential for learning, for who we are, for how we navigate the world. Your readings delved into the fascinating biology of memory, how those memories are formed, stored, and retrieved.
So how are memories actually created in the brain? Where is all that information stored?
Just like learning, memory formation involves those changes in the connections between neurons. Those same processes of synaptic plasticity, LTP and LTD, are at play.
So when we experience something memorable, the relevant connections get strengthened, and that makes it easier for those neurons to fire together and reactivate the memory later.
Exactly. And different types of memories are stored in different parts of the brain. We have sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, and working memory.
Okay, a lot going on there. Let's start with sensory memory. What's that all about?
Sensory memory is super brief. It lasts only a few seconds. It's like a quick echo of sensory information, a snapshot of what we just saw, heard, touched, tasted, or smelled.
Like the image of a car driving by or the sound of a door slamming?
Exactly. It's stored in the sensory cortices, the areas of the brain that process sensory information.
So each sense has its own little temporary storage area.
That's right. Then we have short-term memory, which lasts a bit longer, maybe up to 30 seconds. It's like a mental scratch pad holding a small amount of information in mind.
Like remembering a phone number long enough to dial it or a short grocery list.
Precisely. And this type of memory is thought to be stored in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, always busy. It's amazing how it's involved in so many different cognitive functions, memory included. But what about long-term memory? That's where those really enduring memories live, right?
Exactly. Long-term memory is the most durable kind. It lasts for days, weeks, years, even a lifetime. It's like this vast library of information we can access.
Our childhood memories, our knowledge of the world, personal experiences, all in long-term storage.
All there. And it's thought to be stored across various brain regions, including the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cortex.
So different types of long-term memories are housed in different places.
You got it. The hippocampus is key for forming new episodic memories, memories of events. The amygdala is involved with emotional memories, and the cortex stores semantic memories, or general knowledge.
It's amazing how all that information is tucked away, ready to be accessed when we need it. But sometimes those memories can be lost or become inaccessible, right? Like with amnesia.
Amnesia is a loss of memory, and it can be caused by a lot of things: brain injury, stroke, certain diseases, or even psychological trauma.
And there are different types of amnesia, right?
Yes, 2 main types: anterograde and retrograde. Anterograde amnesia is the inability to form new memories after the event that caused the amnesia.
So someone with anterograde amnesia could meet a new person, but forget their name a few minutes later.
Exactly. They can't create new long-term memories. Retrograde amnesia, on the other hand, is the loss of memories from before the amnesia-causing event. And retrograde amnesia is the loss of memories from before the amnesia-causing event.
So they might not remember their childhood or even who they are.
In severe cases, yes. It's like losing pieces of your own personal history.
It really makes you realize how fragile our memories can be and how much they contribute to who we are.
Absolutely. Our memories shape our identities, our relationships, our understanding of the world. They're precious.
Speaking of our sense of self, I want to circle back to that topic of consciousness we touched on earlier. What is consciousness, really? How does it work?
Consciousness. One of the most profound and enduring mysteries of the human mind.
It's a question that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries, and we're still searching for answers. Your readings delve into some pretty deep philosophical and scientific perspectives on consciousness.
Yeah, there's no single universally accepted definition or explanation. It's a complex and multifaceted phenomenon.
So let's explore some of the different approaches to understanding consciousness.
Mm.
Your readings mention materialism, idealism, and dualism. Can you unpack those for us?
Sure. Those are some of the classic philosophical positions on the mind-body problem, the relationship between the physical brain and the subjective experience of consciousness.
Okay, so let's break those down. What's materialism all about?
Materialism says that everything in the universe, including consciousness, is ultimately made up of matter.
So consciousness is just a product of the brain, a result of those complex neural processes we've been discussing.
Exactly. No magic, no mystery, just physics and chemistry.
Okay, so what about idealism? How is that different?
Idealism kind of flips that on its head, suggesting that consciousness is the fundamental reality and that the material world, including the brain, is somehow derived from or dependent upon consciousness.
Whoa. So in that view, it's like the mind creates matter. That's pretty radical.
It is. It definitely challenges our conventional way of thinking about the world.
And then there's dualism. What's that all about?
Dualism proposes that mind and matter are two distinct substances, interacting with each other, but fundamentally different.
So it's like there's this physical brain and this non-physical mind that are somehow connected, but not the same thing.
Exactly. And that raises the question of how those two interact. How does an immaterial mind influence a material brain?
Yeah, it's a head scratcher for sure.
Yeah.
And these aren't the only approaches to understanding consciousness, are they?
Not even close. There are many other theories and variations out there. For example, panpsychism, which suggests that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, present in all matter.
So even a rock has some level of consciousness.
That's the basic idea, though it's certainly a controversial one.
Pretty wild. What about integrated information theory?
Integrated information theory proposes that consciousness arises from the complexity of information processing in a system.
So the more complex a system is, the more conscious it is?
That's the basic premise. It's a very mathematical and computational approach to understanding consciousness.
Okay, so we've got all these theories, but how do we actually study consciousness scientifically? How do we measure something so subjective and elusive?
Your readings talk about different methods, including introspection, behavioral observation, and brain imaging.
Right. Introspection is basically just looking inward at our own conscious experiences.
Exactly. It's a good starting point, but it's obviously subjective and difficult to study objectively.
And behavioral observation involves watching humans and animals to try to infer their conscious states.
Right. We observe their actions, their reactions, their responses to stimuli to try to understand what might be going on in their minds.
And brain imaging allows us to actually see what's happening in the brain doing different conscious experiences.
Exactly. We can see which areas are active when someone's paying attention, making decisions, feeling emotions, even dreaming.
It's incredible how far we've come in our ability to study the brain, but it's clear that consciousness is still this big, beautiful mystery.
It is. And it'll probably continue to challenge us for a long time.
This has been an amazing journey. We've covered so much from the basic building blocks of the brain to the complexities of consciousness.
It's been a pleasure exploring this fascinating field with you.
And I hope you, our listeners, have gained a deeper appreciation for the amazing and intricate world of biological psychology.
Absolutely. It's a field that's constantly evolving, with new discoveries being made all the time.
And we'll leave you with this. Your brain is a powerful and adaptable organ. Take care of it, challenge it, and never stop being curious about its mysteries. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.